Hello everyone. My name is Bruce Baer, Dean, University of Washington College of Forest Resources, and on behalf of the college, I wish to welcome all of you to this 2009 winter lecture entitled Sustaining Our Northwest World, Carnivore Conservation in the Pacific Northwest. We all know that demographic, economic, and environmental forces are reshaping research and educational paradigms, and this lecture is just one example of the work going on at the College of Forest Resources to sustain our Northwest world. Programs in our college highlight the dynamic balance required to meet the growing natural resource needs of society while sustaining the environmental, economic, and cultural values we associate with our nation's urban and wildland resources. This lecture is a companion to the college's Denman Forestry Issues series, also seen on UwTV and the Research Channel, and both series contribute to the college's vision of world-class leadership in sustaining natural resources and environmental services throughout the region and beyond in order to improve the lives of future generations while satisfying the needs of people today. We are pleased to present this lecture in partnership with the University of Washington Alumni Association. We are also grateful for the support of the Rachel A. Woods Endowment, which is underwriting a portion of this series, and to members of the college's Dean's Club for their financial support. I encourage you to contact the college at www.cfr.washington.edu to explore the broad nature of natural resource issues we are studying and to learn how our college plans to educate the next generation of natural resource scientists and leaders while leveraging new technology to sustain our Northwest world. Our lecture is presented by University of Washington College of Forest Resources Assistant Professor Aaron Wirsing, who discusses some highlights of his research with tiger-shark prey interactions in Australia, as well as carnivore research conducted closer to home in North America. Professor Wirsing joined our faculty in September 2008, coming to us from Florida International University, where he was a postdoc in the Department of Biological Sciences. His formal education consists of an A.B. in biology from Bowdoin College in 1996, an M.S. in wildlife resources from the University of Idaho in 2001, and a Ph.D. in biological sciences from Simon Fraser University in 2005. He is educated as a wildlife scientist specializing in behavioral ecology, with special emphasis on predator-prey interactions. His lecture is especially important in light of the ongoing discussion of the role that large predators play in healthy ecosystems, and how interactions between these predators, human populations, and global climate change may jointly affect forests of the Pacific Northwest. Suffice it to say that these probable impacts might seriously affect the sustainability of our forest and wildlife populations as we know them today. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Assistant Professor Aaron Wirsing, who will speak on carnivore conservation in the Pacific Northwest.
All right, good evening and welcome. I'd like to thank Dean Baer for that nice introduction and be the second to welcome you to this year's installment of the College of Forest Resources Sustaining Our Northwest World lecture series. As Dean Baer mentioned, I am new here, having begun my post as a wildlife ecologist in the College of Forest Resources back in September of 2008. Despite my recent arrival, I'm very familiar with the numerous carnivore conservation issues that are currently at play in this region, and it is in fact the existence of these very issues that makes my job here so exciting. My training, as Dean Baer mentioned, is as a behavioral ecologist, which means that my research explores animal decision-making, and my specialty is animal decision-making under the risk of predation. That means that my research program focuses on the ability of individual animals to cope with predation as they go about their daily lives. My overall goal here this evening is not only to convince you that the study of anti-predator behavior is a fascinating academic pursuit, but also to reveal to you that the study of anti-predator behavior also has real applications for the conservation and restoration of predators right here in the Northwest. So in aquatic, marine, and terrestrial systems, many populations of large predators are undergoing steep declines or have been reduced relative to historical levels. For example, the American crocodile, an apex aquatic predator, exists now as a population of only a few thousand individuals sequestered deep in the heart of the Florida coastal Everglades. In the Northwest Pacific, the sleeper shark, a large benthic marine predator, is also in big trouble, having been decimated by trawler bycatch, as you can see from the picture at the bottom. And here in the western United States, the gray wolf, though rebounding in some locations, still continues to occupy but a fraction of its former range. Therefore, fueled largely by growing recognition of the potential ecological importance of these large predators in communities and ecosystems, there is growing conviction that we must work hard to protect large predator populations in areas where they remain, and just as importantly, to restore large carnivores in areas where their numbers have been depressed by human activities. Along with this growing concern for the plight of large predators has come increased recognition amongst biologists like myself that we must do a much better job of overcoming two persistent challenges to the conservation and restoration of large carnivores. Namely, we must first do a better job of overcoming the challenge of more reliably predicting the consequences of large predator loss in particular systems. In other words, we have to be better at forecasting how ecosystems are likely to change in the absence of predators that were formerly there. If we can do that, we can make a much more effective case for protecting and conserving those species. Secondly, we must also do a much better job of developing more reliable indicators of successful predator recovery in areas and situations where we want to bring their numbers back to formerly healthy levels. We have to do a better job, in other words, of knowing ourselves and of being able to show the public and policymakers that predator numbers have been restored to healthy levels such that they are once again playing their full ecological role and contributing maximally to ecosystem health. If we can do that, we can better meet the criticisms of those who would argue that there is no value of predator conservation and restoration, and that we don't have a good idea of when predators are fully back in systems. And we can also win the continued support of the public and win continued support from financiers of conservation efforts. For the remainder of this talk, I'm going to try to do two things. One, drawing examples both from my work on predator-prey interactions in Western Australia and from a couple of nifty studies of predator-prey interactions in terrestrial systems in the western United States. I'm going to attempt to convince you that the loss of predators from ecosystems can result in dramatic changes in prey anti-predator behavior that can ultimately trigger radical ecosystem degradation. Then, with the tight link between predation risk and anti-predator behavior in mind, I'm going to continue by arguing that studies of anti-predator behavior in particular systems can not only help us to better forecast the consequences of predator declines from particular systems and thereby make a more effective case for conservation, but also to help us establish when predator recovery efforts are complete, when predators have truly been restored to healthy levels and therefore contribute maximally to ecosystem health. If we can do that, we can again win continued support from the public, answer critics who challenge that we don't know when predators are really back, and better inform the public about what numbers of predators in particular systems are correct, and therefore win continued support for our conservation endeavors. My first step in this process is to take you down under to my long-term field research site in Shark Bay, Western Australia. For the past 15 years ago, my colleagues and I have been endeavoring to better explain the dynamics of the Shark Bay ecosystem as part of the Shark Bay Ecosystem Research Project. This is focused particularly on how predation risk, a top-down effect, structures that seagrass community. Now, you might think it a bit funny that a talk on carnivore conservation here in the Northwest in a terrestrial environment should begin with the discussion of how a predator in a marine system organizes ecosystem function. But bear with me, because my goal here in presenting my research from Shark Bay first is to convince you that the lessons we've learned in Shark Bay are highly applicable both to our understanding of the influence of predators right here in the Northwest and applicable to our ability to protect and restore these species. So some of you are probably thinking, where in the world is Shark Bay? It's a pretty remote area. It's a coastal seagrass ecosystem about 600 miles north of Perth, Western Australia, here highlighted in the pink circle. Shark Bay is incredibly remote. It's where the Western Australian outback meets the ocean. But that remoteness is a real boon when it comes to ecological research, because what it enables us to do is explore interactions between species relatively free of any human interference and degradation as a result of human activity. So whatever we learn about species interactions, and in particular the role of predators in Shark Bay, we can use to then better explain what other more degraded systems might look like were they to have a healthy predator population. And again, those lessons are applicable not just in marine systems, but in all systems. Our study site in the eastern Gulf of Shark Bay encompasses about 160 square kilometers off of the Monkey Mia Dolphin Resort, and it features a mosaic of two dominant habitat types. First, shallow bank habitats, here highlighted in light green, that fall in water depths typically less than about 4.5 meters and are covered with lush, diverse beds of seagrass. These shallow banks are intermingled with deeper channels where water depths can go up to about 15 meters and where the substrate is dominated by sand and silt. There's very little seagrass there. Now, these two main habitat types are utilized by a variety of charismatic large marine vertebrates that we've been exploring over the past several years, ranging from seabirds to sea snakes, sea turtles, and on up to some large species like sea cows or dugongs and bottlenose dolphins. And of course, as we've learned, and as we can all appreciate, these animals have very different lives. But there is one thing they all share in common. That is, at least during certain times of year, they're all potential food for the area's lone apex or top predator, the tiger shark, pictured here. Now, for those of you who don't know, the tiger shark is a large cosmopolitan carcharodonid that's found throughout most of the world's warm temperate, subtropical, and tropical waters. It's a primarily coastal species, but it is capable also of long-distance transoceanic movements. The tiger shark is a very large species, with adults topping a length of about 5 meters or about 17.5 feet. They have powerful jaws and serrated teeth that can even cut right through a turtle shell. So they are a very effective predator, and the large size and power of their jaws gives them the capacity to tackle even the largest prey species in Shark Bay. So the answer to the question in Shark Bay to the question, what does a tiger shark eat, is anything it wants. All right? So we can very well appreciate that tiger sharks are a very real predatory threat to the other consumer species we've been studying in Shark Bay. And the consumption of prey by tiger sharks was one of our initial interests, but it was not our primary interest. Our primary interest, rather, was in the changes in behavior that the fear of tiger shark predation can induce in these prey species. To begin investigating that question, to get a better handle on whether the presence of tiger sharks does change the behavior of prey species in ways that have implications for the entire seagrass ecosystem, we first, of course, had to quantify how many tiger sharks use our study site and whether their numbers change throughout the year. Two things that, of course, are going to be very important on the minds of prey species. To better assess use of tiger sharks of our study system and any changes in numbers, we've established a long-term catch and release program that monitors catch rates of tiger sharks on single-hook drum lines deployed in a series of long-term survey zones throughout our study area. All sharks caught on these drum lines are then brought along the boat, as you can see here, measured, sexed, tagged, and then released. This has been a rigorous program involving many hours of effort over the past 10 years, or, well, I guess 13 years, ever since 1997. And so far, as part of this program, we've caught between 500 and 600 sharks. So catching tiger sharks in Shark Bay isn't hard. In fact, those catch rates are an order of magnitude higher than catch rates revealed by similar studies in Hawaii, another area famous for its high tiger shark numbers. So when it comes to a large tiger shark population, Shark Bay is tops. Okay? Now the rigor of our catch and release effort has enabled us not only to very systematically track changes in the numbers of tiger sharks in our study area, but also to determine whether individuals return year after year. This tag and release effort has revealed that tiger shark abundance is not consistent over time in our study area, but rather shows a marked periodic pattern of fluctuation, as you can see from this figure here. Plotting tiger shark abundance on the y-axis, indexed by us in terms of the number of tiger sharks caught per hour of fishing effort, against day of year on the x-axis pooled across all the years of our study. As you can see from this figure, tiger shark numbers each year tend to be very high during the height of the warm season in February, and then decline gradually to a nadir in July, and then increase gradually back up to peak numbers the following February. Now this pattern is, while dramatic, is highly conserved across years. It's very consistent year to year, and because of that we've been able to take advantage of it to conduct a natural experiment, if you will, asking particularly whether animals on the dinner menu for tiger sharks are, one, aware of changes in tiger shark numbers, and if so, whether they behave accordingly. Do they behave extra cautiously when tiger sharks are abundant and there's need for defensive investment? And do they relax when tiger sharks are scarce in the study area and worry about other concerns, like food? When tiger sharks are in our study area, we were also interested in their relative use of those two major habitat types I introduced to you earlier, shallow banks and deep channels. To get at that, we've equipped a number of tiger sharks we've caught with underwater video and acoustic monitoring system pictured here, otherwise known as critter cams. We've deployed about 50 of these so far, and they enable us to release the shark and then follow closely its underwater movements, tracking exactly where it goes and documenting whether they have a preference for one habitat type over the other. Well, these deployments have revealed a marked pattern of habitat preference. Tiger sharks just don't go willy-nilly swimming around our study site. They tend to hunt one habitat in particular, and that's shown by this figure here, plotting on the y-axis the observed use of shallow bank and deep water habitats minus that expected at random. Because this is an observed minus expected figure, values exceeding 0 indicate overuse of a particular habitat type relative to random expectations. Values of 0 indicate neither preference nor avoidance, and values falling below 0 equal underuse or avoidance of a particular habitat type relative to expectations at random. What you can see from this figure is that tiger sharks really like hunting over shallow banks. They dramatically overuse shallow banks relative to random expectations, and they avoid deep water, meaning that deep water serves effectively as a refuge from predation for animals seeking to avoid sharks. So the answer to us should be simple then. When sharks are in the environment, all their prey should pile into deep water, right? Well, unfortunately, the story isn't so simple because, in particular for the animals I'm going to talk about today, most of their food is located in the shallows, so they just don't have the luxury of waiting sharks out in the deep. If they did that, they would slowly starve. Instead, they face a very difficult daily decision when tiger sharks are around, namely the following conundrum. They must decide between foraging on abundant food resources in the dangerous shallows, where tiger sharks are likely to attack them, or foraging for what scraps are available in deeper water, much more impoverished area, but that afford relatively high safety from sharks. So it's a classic choice between food or safety. But if you choose safety, you sacrifice your nutritional condition. We've assessed how a variety of prey species negotiate this conundrum by carefully monitoring their use of shallow bank and deep channel habitats in a series of survey zones allocated equally to shallow and deep habitat throughout our study area. Deep habitat survey zones here in blue, and shallow habitat survey zones are in green. By systematically transecting through each of these survey zones by a boat and recording where we tend to see various species at various times of year, we've been able to ask whether particular consumers consistently spend most of their time feeding on rich resources in the shallows, or whether they gradually pull out of the shallows into the safety of deep water as tiger shark numbers go up. How do they negotiate this trade-off? Well, we've asked that of a whole host of different prey species, and they're kind of pictured here, all of which are potential food for tiger sharks, ranging from a couple of species of sea turtles, like the green turtle here, the herbivorous dugong, the olive-headed sea snake, pied cormorants, and bottlenose dolphins, and there are others as well. Now, I don't have the time to touch on the interactions between all these various prey species and tiger sharks today, so for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to talk about two interactions in particular, that between tiger sharks and the herbivorous dugong and the piscivorous bottlenose dolphin. So after rigorously assessing whether bottlenose dolphins and dugongs shift between habitats as a function of changes in tiger shark abundance, did we find that these species are responsive to increases in tiger shark predation danger, or were they worried about other concerns, like just acquiring food? Well, to answer that, I'm now going to present to you a series of figures that look very much like this one here. These figures are all based on the premise that in the absence of any danger of predation, consumers should distribute themselves across the landscape in proportion to food supply. They should worry about food, such that the proportion of consumers in any one patch should be equivalent to the overall proportion of food in that patch, meaning that if we take a patch and we divide resident consumer density by food availability, we'll get a value of 1, and that's signified by the dashed yellow line in this figure. So the dashed yellow line signifies equivalence between consumer use and food availability, a match, if you will. For the purposes of today's talk, for all these figures, the patch that will be of interest to us is shallow banks. Okay, so the dashed yellow line indicates equivalence between the use of shallow banks and the level of use expected based upon food, a match between use and food availability. Now, if in our system any particular consumer is insensitive to changes in tiger shark predation danger, if they're not worried about sharks, then we would expect that irrespective of changes in tiger shark abundance, here shown on the x-axis, in other words, changes in overall danger of shark attack, the proportion of that consumer in shallow bank habitat should consistently match the proportion of food in that shallow habitat. In other words, the consumer should consistently fall upon the dashed yellow line, indicating no response to the predator. They're always worried about food no matter how predators are around, and therefore they match the supply of the food across the landscape, ensuring each individual consumer equal and optimal share of the food. If, on the other hand, a consumer is responsive to changes in the danger of predation, then we expect to observe a different trend, here signified by the purple arrow. Namely, we expect them to distribute themselves in proportion to food supply when there are very few sharks around. But as shark abundance goes up, we expect the proportion of that consumer in shallow bank habitat to fall farther and farther below the level expected based upon the proportion of food in shallow habitat. Again, here shown by the purple arrow. What this would mean is that as the danger of tiger shark predation goes up, individual consumers become more and more willing to crowd into deep habitat where their food is not plentiful, and therefore become more and more willing to give up more and more food in shallow habitat in return for the safety offered by the deep. They basically become more and more willing to trade food in the shallows for safety in deep water. Okay, they're accepting less food to avoid their predator. That's what the purple arrow signifies. Another shorthand way of putting that is that if we see data conforming to this purple arrow as opposed to consistently falling along the dashed yellow line, it means the tiger shark, when present, has effectively chased this consumer out of its favorite foraging area. Okay? Now, I've put the picture of the tiger shark here in the top right-hand corner just as a reminder to you that tiger sharks, when they're present, overuse shallow habitat. So in other words, if you move farther and farther away from the shallows, you're avoiding your predator. So let's first consider the dugong. Remember I mentioned that dugongs are herbivorous. In fact, they're exclusively herbivorous. They rely entirely on seagrass. They're the world's only exclusively herbivorous marine mammal. But of course, that poses a very big problem for them in Shark Bay. They face that tough decision. They have to go into the shallows to feed because there's just not enough seagrass for them in the deep. But when they go into the shallows, they face the prospect of being eaten by a tiger shark. So how do dugongs negotiate that conundrum? Well, we know that dugongs are a favored food item for sharks. Sharks really like to go after dugongs. So it was quite reasonable to us to predict in advance that dugongs would respond to increases in shark numbers and gradually pull into deep habitat, trading food in the shallows for the safety of the deep. But did they in fact do that? Did they avoid their predator and trade food for safety? The answer, based upon our transect data, is a resounding yes. We have data here that very clearly conform to that purple arrow. What that means is that at low tiger shark density, when tiger sharks were absent from the study area, the proportion of dugongs in shallow bank habitat matched the proportion of food in shallow habitat. Dugongs matched their food supply. So the value of dugong distribution at very low tiger shark abundance falls right along that dashed yellow line. However, as tiger sharks began pouring into the study area and the danger of predation went up, individual dugong consumers became more and more willing to overcrowd deep habitat. They were going where their food just isn't very available. And in so doing, they were giving up more and more food they might acquire in the shallows, but that was now being rendered unavailable by the presence of dangerous tiger sharks. And as tiger shark abundance reached really high levels, dugongs dramatically underused shallow habitat. The proportion of dugongs in shallow bank habitat fell far below the level predicted by food supply. So at that point, dugongs were manifesting a very strong anti-predator response to tiger sharks, trading a lot of food for the safety offered by impoverished deep habitats. So tiger sharks seem to exert a very powerful influence on dugongs. How about bottlenose dolphins? They're quite different from dugongs. They're sleek, mobile, agile animals, and they feed on fish, not seagrass. So maybe we might predict that they would behave differently from dugongs in relation to sharks. But in fact, dolphins and dugongs share a common problem, which is that just like dugongs, most of the food for dolphins is located in the shallows. Most of the fishes upon which they feed are over those shallow banks. So they too face that difficult choice between waiting tiger sharks out in the deep and slowly starving, or pushing into the shallows and feeding on rich food resources but at the risk of becoming a meal themselves. So we predicted that, like dugongs, bottlenose dolphins would match their food when tiger sharks were scarce and pull into deep habitat away from sharks as shark numbers went up, trading food for safety. Again, avoiding their predators, but at the expense of their own nutritional condition. And again, that's what we observed. When tiger sharks were absent from the study area, we observed a match between dolphin distribution across shallow bank and deep channel habitats and food supply across these two habitats. Dolphins matched their food supply, giving each consumer equal and optimal access to food. But when tiger shark abundance was high and there was a high likelihood of being eaten by sharks, like dugongs, dolphins began to abandon shallow habitats, crowding into deeper areas where fish weren't as plentiful. The benefit presumably being decreased likelihood of bumping into a shark. So sharks exert a behavioral effect on dolphins as well, chasing them out of their favorite foraging area. So to summarize then, both dugongs and bottlenose dolphins use shallow and deep waters in our study area in proportion to food supply when tiger sharks are absent. And that makes total sense. If there's nothing to worry about in terms of predation, why would you shift your habitats as a function of predation? Of course not. You're going to worry about other concerns like getting enough food. When sharks are present, however, both of these prey species radically alter their habitat use, pushing into deep habitat even though there's very little food there. They trade food for safety. So tiger sharks exert a powerful behavioral effect on both of these species. And it's very worth pointing out here that both dugongs and bottlenose dolphins, although they're often attacked, rarely fall prey to tiger sharks. They're long-lived animals. So had, at the beginning of our investigation, we focused exclusively on tiger shark-inflicted mortality, we would have wrongly concluded that tiger sharks exert a very small influence on the lives of dolphins and dugongs. We might have ignored this relationship altogether. But in fact, by focusing on behavior, we actually reveal that tiger sharks have a very strong impact on these two consumers. And this impact has potential implications for the ecosystem. So my general message here before I go on is that whenever we're exploring relationships between predators and prey, it's very important that we not only focus on consumption of prey, but also on the influences of predators on prey behavior. The total effect is a function of both. So I mentioned some indirect effects, and here they are. By changing dugong and dolphin behavior, by chasing these species out of the shallows, it's very likely that tiger sharks exert strong indirect positive effects on the seagrass itself as well as seagrass fishes. Specifically, by chasing dugongs clear out of the shallows, tiger sharks very likely reduce the rate of herbivory experienced by seagrass and therefore indirectly release seagrass from the control imposed by dugongs, allowing seagrass meadows to flourish, allowing for increased growth, health, and biomass. And by the same token, by chasing dolphins out of the shallows, tiger sharks very likely indirectly impact seagrass fishes, giving them a refuge from piscivory and allowing for larger seagrass populations. So we have two putative indirect interactions between tiger sharks and seagrass fishes, potentially transmitted not by death, but by changes in prey behavior alone. And these putative indirect interactions can allow us to actually make some compelling predictions about what might happen in Shark Bay were we to take sharks out of the system. In other words, if sharks were to be lost from Shark Bay, and although that's not a realistic possibility right now because the population is healthy, there are fishing impacts elsewhere. So the prospect of the loss of tiger sharks is real in the long run. If we were to lose sharks, we might expect to witness dramatic increases in dugong herbivory and dolphin piscivory during periods when sharks would otherwise be there. And these increases in herbivory and piscivory might very well lead to sparser overgrazed seagrass meadows and reduced fish populations. Now, we haven't yet been able to analyze these scenarios rigorously because, of course, we can't very well go into the protected Shark Bay environment and take sharks out. right? We can't explore that possibility. However, we can look at other indirect pieces of evidence that do provide strong support for the plausibility and viability of these predictions. One comes from Shark Bay. I mentioned earlier that we expect that in the absence of sharks, the pressure imposed on seagrass by dugong herbivory would grow. Well, we've been going out on these shallow banks and putting cages in various areas that protect the seagrass from herbivory. If we compare seagrass characteristics in the cages versus nearby control sites, we can get an index of the strength of herbivory by dugongs and other grazers in the system. Our results are very preliminary, but so far they suggest that the number of tiger sharks does have an impact on grazing pressure in the shallows. The more tiger sharks they are, the less the difference between control and protected sites. That information does suggest to us that were we to lose tiger sharks on a permanent basis, grazing rates would go up, imperiling shark-based seagrass. We have another very important and interesting piece of information coming to us from the Caribbean. There are a number of seagrass systems in the Caribbean that share a lot in common with Shark Bay, save one thing: they've lost their sharks, or at least they've lost most of their sharks. So grazers there are no longer fettered by the risk of predation. And biologists are now realizing that in those areas, grazers are foraging at an unbridled rate and imperiling the seagrass. They've virtually eliminated once healthy seagrass meadows. So we have some strong inferential support from those systems in the Caribbean suggesting that our prediction in Shark Bay is valid, that if you take top predators like sharks away, the grazers do go crazy and imperil the vegetation. This is a lesson we can take with us to terrestrial systems as well. So in summary then, our long-term research in Shark Bay suggests that tiger sharks indirectly benefit marine plants, and possibly fishes, although we haven't explored it yet, by altering prey behavior. And therefore, we can use known patterns of prey behavior in the presence of sharks to more effectively predict what would happen to a system if we took sharks away, right? We predicted in Shark Bay that in the absence of sharks, both dolphins and dugongs push onto those shallow banks in the warm season and hammer seagrass and fishes. And at least with dugongs, we appear to see that that's the case. And we also have evidence from the Caribbean showing that, yes, grazing rates do go up in the absence of a top predator. So in the next phase of our talk then, let's shift to terrestrial systems. I've said already that I think these results from Shark Bay are very generally applicable because they show that in a system, even when predator-induced mortality rates are low, behavioral changes by prey alone can have a huge impact on the prey's resource. And therefore, if you take the predator away, you get entirely different ecosystem dynamics. That's a general lesson we can apply everywhere. But I think it's important to point out, to ask whether there are similar scenarios unfolding in terrestrial systems here in the western United States. Do terrestrial carnivores, like tiger sharks, invoke similar behavioral changes in their prey that lead to strong indirect effects on ecosystem properties? Well, I can tell you that the answer is a resounding yes. And I'm going to illustrate that using two examples from some nifty recent work. My first example deals with the gray wolf in Yellowstone National Park. Many of you, having shown up here, are probably familiar with this issue. Just as a brief recap, in the early part of the 20th century, wolves were virtually, if not absolutely, extirpated from the Yellowstone ecosystem. And it was not until 1995 that a small population was returned to the area. That population has since grown. Here's one of the exciting parts. In the years immediately preceding that wolf repatriation, park managers and biologists eagerly anticipated the changes that they would see following the return of wolves to the Yellowstone ecosystem. In particular, they thought they very well might see changes in the behavior of one of the wolf's major prey species, elk, that would ultimately release plants in certain areas that were being overbrowsed. So they eagerly awaited what would happen. When wolves were reintroduced, their population rapidly grew. They expanded to once again fill their old ecological niche. And wouldn't you know, those very predictions those biologists made did occur. Elk did change their behavior in a manner that has affected the entire ecosystem by shrinking the elk population and releasing plants. Let's go a bit into the detail. So as has been documented in a number of studies, including a recent paper by Ripple and Vesta in 2007 issue of Biological Conservation, following the return of wolves to the ecosystem, elk once again were picking up on the risk of wolf predation. And the risk of wolf predation is especially high in riparian areas where wolves are really effective at launching lethal attacks. So biologists thought that elk might respond to the presence of wolves by pulling away from these riparian areas that previously had been heavily overbrowsed. And that's exactly what has occurred. Elk have dramatically shifted their habitat use following the return of wolves. They now avoid riparian areas to a much greater extent than they once did. This radical behavioral shift in elk has triggered two changes in Yellowstone, the first involving the elk population. Following the recovery of wolves in this system, the northern Yellowstone elk herd has declined by about 43%. Some of this, of course, is due to wolf mortality. But increases in mortality from wolves have only been modest in this area of the ecosystem following the return of wolves. So they can't really explain this dramatic decline in the size of the elk population. What does? Elk behavior. Those riparian foraging areas are highly profitable for elk. So when they respond to predation risk by abandoning them, they have to go to other areas where feeding isn't as good. That means mothers are in poorer nutritional condition and they're less able to successfully rear their calves. They're poorer mothers. And as poorer mothers, they don't recruit as many young elk into the population, resulting in lower levels of productivity and a dramatic decline in the overall size of the elk population. The general lesson to take away here is that predators can actually control prey population size without even killing very many prey individuals. We see the same thing in Shark Bay. Tiger sharks don't kill very many dugongs, but they render a lot of seagrass unavailable to dugongs. So we would predict that if you take tiger sharks away, dugong population would very likely grow. Back to Yellowstone. The change in elk behavior has not only contributed to the reduction in elk population size, it has also, as predicted, resulted in a plant resurgence in these riparian areas. Species like aspen, willow, and cottonwood were being severely overbrowsed in certain areas by elk that didn't have to worry about wolf predation. But with the return of wolves, elk now have to be more cautious, have pulled out of riparian areas, and that has released these tree species. And we've seen a resurgence of growth in these areas and radical changes over the past 14, 15 years in riparian plant communities. They've been restored to healthier levels with the return of the wolf. So in summary then, the loss of wolves, though we didn't know it then, from Yellowstone, resulted gradually in a heavily overbrowsed system because of behavioral changes in elk that no longer had to worry about the risk of predation, that featured reduced plant diversity and less healthy overall riparian plant communities. And it was only with the return of the wolf that this imbalance was redressed, that elk behavior changed and plant species were once again released from heavy browsing. We can predict from this phenomenon, then, that the return of wolves to other areas might very well invoke similar changes in prey behavior and ecosystem properties, and it would be very interesting to test that. Our final example involves mountain lions in Yosemite National Park. Like wolves, mountain lions were displaced from, or not in Yosemite, but mountain lions were displaced from Yosemite National Park in the early part of the 20th century by humans. And at the time, there was very little appreciation for the potential consequences of that displacement, so little was done. Therefore, it took a recent retrospective study, again by Ripple and Besta, to reveal that the loss of mountain lions had a profound effect, not just on prey behavior, but on the entire ecosystem there in Yosemite. Specifically, what happened is the loss of mountain lion predation risk allowed for much heavier browsing and an increase in the population size of mule deer. And mule deer heavily browse a variety of sapling species, including saplings of black oak. So with mule deer no longer constrained by the risk of predation, their rates of herbivory skyrocketed, suppressing recruitment of black oak and other tree species. Gradually, these unbridled rates of mule deer herbivory transformed the entire park, apparently, from a more forested ecosystem to an open park-like ecosystem we see today. So that's interesting because visitors to Yosemite may think they're viewing a historical vignette of maybe a relatively pristine system, but what in fact they're witnessing is an artificial system created in part by the loss of a top predator, the mountain lion. So in sum then, without the risk of mountain lion predation in Yosemite, unfettered browsing by mule deer has transformed and impoverished Yosemite's forests, transforming the entire ecosystem gradually from a more forested ecosystem to one that's more open and park-like. We could predict, based upon this pattern, that the return of mountain lions might have the reverse effect. Okay, down the home stretch we go. Now we have results from these three disparate systems, one in a marine system way down in Shark Bay, two from terrestrial systems here in the western United States. All three feature striking parallels between the role played by predators in the ecosystem, indirectly influencing consumer resources, not by inflicting much mortality or modest levels of mortality, but primarily by changing behavior. What general rules can we draw from the parallels between these three studies, now that we have some confidence in this interaction? Well, I think the first conclusion is that all three suggest that irrespective of system, where we're talking about marine or terrestrial systems, large predators can indirectly benefit plant communities and other prey resources by altering the behavior of prey, herbivores, for example. In Shark Bay, for example, tiger sharks change the behavior of dugongs in a manner that seems to have very important implications for the health of the seagrass meadows there. And it's important to point out that these indirect relationships between top predators and prey resources can occur even in cases where the top predator very rarely kills its prey. In Shark Bay in particular, tiger sharks inflict very low mortality rates on dugongs and dolphins. And even in Yellowstone, wolves have triggered dramatic ecosystem restructuring, not so much because they consume prey. They certainly do that, and that's an important mechanism. But that change is being driven perhaps equally as strongly, if not more so, by changes in prey behavior. So that's a general lesson we can take away. Because the risk of predation has such a strong influence in many cases on prey behavior and can therefore indirectly impact ecosystem properties, we can use this information, we can use our knowledge now to predict that ecosystems lacking top predators where they once were there will often be impoverished because of unbridled foraging by herbivores with little to fear. Right? The loss of mountain lions in Yosemite allowed mule deer foraging and herbivory to skyrocket, transforming the very park from a forested to an open park-like environment. Okay? So the loss of top predators has very important implications for ecosystem properties, even if the predator hasn't historically inflicted a lot of mortality. We've got to focus on behavior as well. Because of this tight link between predation risk, prey behavior, and ecosystem properties, we can use known patterns of anti-predator behavior in particular systems to predict the nature of ecosystem impoverishment in the absence of predators. Right? In Yellowstone, for example, known patterns of elk anti-predator behavior in response to wolves enabled park biologists and managers to actually come up with some really reliable predictions about how Yellowstone would change following the return of wolves. And those predictions were confirmed. So because we knew how elk respond to wolves elsewhere and historically, we were able to predict their behavioral shift and the subsequent changes to riparian areas in Yellowstone. Because anti-predator behavioral studies give us this enhanced predictive ability, they can be used in conjunction with other information to make a better case for conservation, right? One of the ways we can make a strong case for conservation is by explaining what's going to happen to a particular area if the predator is lost. Often we're challenged to do that. So anti-predator behavior studies can help us overcome that challenge. But of course, we're interested in more than just making a more effective case for conservation, right? In some areas, predator numbers have been diminished well below the threshold where they have any sort of ecological interaction with their prey. And in those areas, we have an interest, in the interest of ecosystem health, in bringing those predators back to meaningful levels, right? So we want to go beyond making the case for conservation and guide those recovery programs so that they can bring predators back to a level where they are once again exerting their full impact on ecosystems. All right? How do we do that? Well, that's again where assays of anti-predator behavior come in. What we've learned so far about the importance of anti-predator behavior tells us that predator restoration can promote ecosystem recovery. We know that from a variety of studies. But what is becoming more and more apparent is that full ecosystem recovery in the presence of a once depressed predator is not going to occur unless the predator once again elicits the full range of anti-predator behavior. It's not enough for the predator just to be back. It has to be back in large enough numbers that prey once again perceive it to be a threat and make adjustments. If they don't, the predator will not be at a fully healthy level and will not be contributing maximally to the restoration of that ecosystem. That's a really important general lesson. So what can we take from that lesson? Well, we can conclude that whether we're talking about predator conservation in marine or terrestrial systems, that we must manage carnivore populations beyond demography. We must move beyond simple numerical benchmarks. They are helpful. They are effective guides, but they are insufficient to tell us when a predator population is fully back in a system. If we are interested in meaningful predator restoration, we should instead accompany predator recovery efforts with studies of anti-predator behavior by prey. Those can tell us whether prey are once again perceiving those predators to be a threat, and that's an objective, concrete piece of evidence that can actually let us know that yes, that predator really is back. It's not just back in a few numbers, it's back in large enough numbers that it's inspiring fear and inducing behavioral changes that have real consequences for the ecosystem, right? Those behavioral changes give us a hint that the predator is once again restoring the ecosystem to a healthy level. If we accompany our recovery efforts with assays of anti-predator behavior and do a better job of verifying that predators are back, we will have met that second persistent challenge to carnivore conservation, which is really knowing and convincing the public and policymakers that we've brought the predator population back to a meaningful level. And if we can do that, if we can better verify that predators are back, we'll again be able to win continued support from the public and policymakers and answer the criticisms of those who question our ability to successfully bring a predator population back. I mentioned earlier on that I'm incredibly excited to be here at the University of Washington, and one of the many reasons for that is that here in the Northwest, carnivore conservation is at the forefront. It's a controversial issue, but it's a very exciting issue, and there are a number of predator species that are being actively managed or need better management right now. I think studies of anti-predator behavior can contribute to the management of a variety of these species. I'll just give you three here. This list is certainly not exhaustive. The first is, again, the gray wolf. Now, gray wolves are not very common throughout much of Washington state, but there is some evidence that numbers are on the rebound, that they're pushing westward, perhaps as far as the eastern slopes of the North Cascades. But we don't know a whole lot yet about their numbers in particular areas, and certainly nothing about whether they're once again exerting impacts on behavior, as they presumably did of old. Assays of anti-predator behavior can help identify areas where the wolf is indeed back and changing prey behavior. Therefore, these kinds of studies could help us do a better job of managing the recovery and recolonization of these species. They can also allow us to predict what might happen as wolf numbers continue to go up, right? If they start changing behavior, we can look at the direction of that behavioral change to make some predictions about gradual changes to ecosystems like the North Cascades as wolf numbers continue to recover. Another species of interest is the mountain lion. After decades of persecution, the mountain lion is really on the rebound in a lot of areas in this state, leading to a lot of debate, a lot of argument, a lot of interest in how many mountain lions are enough in particular regions, about how we manage this species and determine whether they've sort of fully recovered in certain areas or become too numerous. Assays of anti-predator behavior aren't the only answer, but again, with respect to this carnivore, I think they could very much help us more effectively manage the species by giving us an additional piece of evidence of whether they are indeed being perceived by prey as a threat. And again, that's an objective piece of evidence we can use to determine whether their recovery in certain areas is complete, as opposed to an arbitrary numerical benchmark which may or may not be valid. Final species I want to touch on is the Canada lynx. Of course, there aren't very many of them left in Washington state. They remain really largely as a small population in the Okanagan region, maybe a few individuals elsewhere, but that's where most of the work towards the management of the species is occurring. And again, I think that assays of anti-predator behavior can help here in terms of identifying areas where lynx are inspiring fear in their prey. We can focus, instead of on the predator, on the prey species and ask the prey to tell us where lynx are. This is not the only answer to the problem of managing lynx, but I think, again, it's a contributing factor. So I'm not just waving my arms up here. I fully intend to put my money where my mouth is. And as part of that, I do have two research projects underway right now. They're in their nascent stages, just getting underway. One is focused on the impacts of gray wolf recovery in the North Cascades ecosystem. As I mentioned, wolves do seem to be moving back into this area, yet we know very little about the consequences of recovery of wolves. We can use studies of anti-predator behavior to help us do two things. One, help better document areas where wolves have returned. We can ask the prey to tell us. And two, based upon observed patterns of behavioral adjustment in the face of wolf return, we can make some predictions about how the North Cascades ecosystem might change as wolf population numbers go back up. Another project is going to focus on using prey behavior as a guide to lynx management in the Okanagan region. As I mentioned earlier, lynx are reclusive animals that are awfully hard to find. We're interested in documenting areas where their presence is having an effect. Perhaps we can use the behavior of one of their major prey species, snowshoe hares, as a means to better do that. We can also use observed behavioral interactions to gain a better handle on the ecological influence of lynx on the overall ecosystem there. So both of these studies are still in their incipient stages, so unfortunately at this point I can only tantalize you with the prospect of their initiation, but I assure you I fully intend to follow through. With that, I don't have anything else to present, so I'm going to take this time to acknowledge some of the major contributors to our long-term work. I'm going to take us back to Shark Bay and say that this is an enormous effort in Western Australia involving the participation of numerous researchers, agencies, and assistants. But two individuals deserve special recognition: Larry Dill of Simon Fraser University and Mike Heithaus of Florida International University, my co-leaders on this project. We've also benefited from the assistance of an army of field volunteers without whose dedication this project never could have come to fruition, and financial support from the National Geographic Society, National Science Foundation, and NSERC Canada. I also want to give special thanks to Ramona Hickey, Tom Mintel, Caroline Rosevere, and University of Washington Television for making this event such a success. And of course, I also want to acknowledge the College of Forest Resources and the University of Washington Alumni Association providing the initiative and for allowing this event to take place. With that said, I want to thank you all so much for coming out here in such large numbers, and at this point I'll try to answer any questions you may have. Thank you. All right, thanks.
If you have any questions, we have a mic on each side, so just step up and fire away. John.
Hello. You've just talked about the effect of the predator requiring adequate numbers. The state of Washington is proposing a limit of 15 breeding pairs before humans can become predators on wolves in the state of Washington. That would possibly be below the threshold that would have any impact, fear impact on the prey. I'd be interested in your ideas about that.
So the question pertained to the validity of the demographic threshold currently out there as part of the wolf management program here in the state. Is 15 breeding pairs enough? Well, we really don't know. I mean, it seems to me to be somewhat of an arbitrary number. I think we have to put it to the test. And so I'm hoping to use assays of anti-predator behavior to put that threshold to the test. One way of determining it is going to particular regions at a certain wolf density and asking whether prey are responding. If they are, that gives us some basis that yes, that number does allow for meaningful interaction between wolves and their prey. On the other hand, if we're seeing no behavioral responses and no subsequent ecosystem changes, that provides us with more an objective basis to at least question the validity of that numerical threshold. So right now, as opposed to relying exclusively on some number, which again is helpful as a basic guide, we need to supplement those kinds of recovery programs with more ecologically based kinds of research, like studies of responses of prey. If we allow prey to tell us whether the wolf is back, that's a more reliable piece of information, I would argue, than some number.
I've got a couple of observations that I was hoping you might be able to comment on. So one would be if you're dealing with a prey species that is less advanced than mammals, might they forget how to deal with a predator if the predator's been absent for many, many, many prey generations? The second would be in the case of reintroducing a predator, if the environment has been constrained while the predator was gone. So for instance, in the case of the, I think with the elk were clustering in the wetlands, you bring back the wolf. If there was nowhere for them to go to, then how could they respond to them? And this all sort of brought about by a speculation that is going on here, where great blue heron colonies are collapsing simultaneous with the recurrence of bald eagles into the area. And, does this point to anything?
Okay, so a great series of questions. The first of which is, can prey species forget how to respond to predators if they've been in the absence of predators for a very long time? The answer is yes, but it often takes a very long time for that to happen. And even in cases where they have temporarily forgotten, if you will, there are a number of nice studies that show that they'll quickly remember. And this extends beyond just cognitively advanced species, if you will. There are a lot of really nice studies to show that even, shall we say, simpler species like bumblebees, copepods, ants have very elegant anti-predator mechanisms. So even species that we would consider to have very short memories or to have very limited cognitive abilities have very elegant means of coping, adjusting their behavior to cope with the risk of predation. But back to the original question, so I think across a wide range of taxa, there is a worry that if the predator has been gone so long, there will be some loss of anti-predator behavior, and that can result in the predator having too strong an effect early on. But that heavy selective pressure of predation can bring that behavior back. And what we find is that in many prey species, that behavior is sort of stored deep down and can be elicited for a rainy day. So the second question was, if the habitat has been changed dramatically such that the prey species no longer has the behavioral options to avoid predators that it once did, that's a big potential problem. The nice thing about the Yellowstone reintroduction is that even though wolves were extirpated, the niche was there. The landscape was relatively untouched, so it was open for wolves to fill once again. In other areas, that might not be the case. Landscape transformation could either render the landscape unusable to the predator or render the landscape such that prey can't respond. And I think we need to have an appreciation for that possibility. In those cases, we would be more hesitant about the sort of positive prospects for predator recovery. In that case, you might either have the predator be unable to establish itself or perhaps exert too strong an effect on a prey no longer to make an adjustment. But again, what's nice about the Northwest is that we have a number of areas where there are still landscapes that should provide for very normal and meaningful interaction between predator and prey. And I think those areas are ripe for predator recovery. As far as, I don't know much about the blue heron eagle interaction, but that could be what's going on. But we would assume over time that if those herons have dealt with eagle predation in the past, that there might be a tendency towards an improvement in anti-predator behavior over time.
Well, we do know one thing. The blue herons are going back to college because they seem to be setting up residence here on campus. Okay, I don't see anybody else, so we will, once again, we want to thank you, Aaron, for your wonderful lecture. Thank you.